Hi, everyone, and welcome to the beginner portion of the explaining of what stock markets are, how they came to be. But today, I'm going to fool you a little bit because we're going to be talking about not stock markets in the very beginning. We're going to be talking about three concepts. The first is money, the second is religion, and the third is capitalism. Two very non-controversial topics. So before we understand what markets are, we have to understand what money is. What exactly is it? Well, for our purposes, let's focus on money is anything that has two principles. And those two principles are, it has universal convertibility. It can turn any one thing into any other thing. This number of bananas costs this much money. This building costs this much money. It can turn one thing into another. The second concept, though, is it has to have universal trust, meaning we both have to agree that this medium of exchange, money, is worth something to both of us. Now, this may seem like a basic concept, but it actually gets very complicated because it is one thing to talk about this amount of bananas costs this much money. But the thing about money that makes it fascinating is that it even works on non-tangible principles. Let's take a principle like healthcare. Now, we may believe that healthcare is a human right. And we may believe that there should be no cost barrier to healthcare. But we live in a society where we have to pay doctors money, we have to pay insurance companies premiums, and they have to serve somebody. So a concept such as healthcare for disadvantaged or disenfranchised people can be turned into a reality with a concept like money. The person who did that, or a person who did that, is Barack Obama through his Obamacare program. And that came with a big price tag, hundreds of billions of dollars. It also cost him an election. It also cost him to lose the midterms to the Republicans in terms of them gaining House seats. But his principle was more important at that time he chose than winning those midterms. But it also can turn into other concepts. If you and I have a disagreement and we're two different nations, rather than going to war and people killing each other, we can settle our differences partially with a medium of exchange where one person or one nation gets compensation in the form of money. Now, back before that we lived in cities and before there were banks and before there was a universal banking system and before there was a stock market, we lived as hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherers had no need of money. They bartered. But when we began to gather into towns and people began to specialize into different jobs, then the need for money became paramount. Let me give you an example. Let's say that you have an apple orchard and you grew all kinds of wonderful, lovely apples, but you were working there so much that your shoes were worn through and you have holes in your shoes. So now you need to go get a pair of shoes. Your neighbor says, "Oh, I know a great shoemaker. Last year, I gave them the leg of one of my pigs, and he gave me a brand new pair of shoes."
Oh, I see.
I bet that if you give him your apples, he'll make you a pair of shoes. So you say, great. And you go into town and you go and you bring a big bushel of apples and you say, I want a new pair of shoes. And the shoemaker looks at you and he says, well, I've never traded shoes for apples before. I do remember talking to your neighbor. He did say that he was going to give me a leg of his pig in exchange for shoes. But you know, my wife really loves legs of pigs. So that's what I did. But, we don't really like apples. And I don't know if I have a need for apples. And the only ever time I ever exchanged shoes for apples before, they weren't those kinds of apples. They were a different kind of apples grown in a different part of the state or the county. So I don't know how much your apples are worth. So that, in order for him to determine that, everyone has got to do all of these calculations in their head about rates of exchange. How many apples for what shoes? How many pigs for what shoes? What is worth it to whom? And really, this becomes very subjective. If the shoemaker doesn't like apples, all the apples in the world are not going to be worth very much to him. If he loves pork, then even a little pig is going to be worth a lot to him. So a universal system of exchange needed to be invented, and human beings were very good at this. But in order to even understand how that came to be originally, I want to just start with one concept. Let's say that all the money in the world was $1,000 and it all lived in one place. We're going to call that place a bank, a house with money in it. All the money in the world is $1,000. And now you are a baker and you want to build a bakery because you say, I think I can feed my children if I'm able to make cakes and sell those cakes. But I don't have a bakery. So you go to the bank and you say, I have this really good idea. I'm a really good baker. My cakes are going to sell. But I just need money. Could you please lend me the money to build a bakery? And the bank says, making cakes is a great idea. We're happy to give you $500 to build your bakery. But they don't give the baker 500 cash dollars. They say to the baker, you're going to open up an account with us, and you're going to get a line of credit worth $500. And credit is just as good as dollars. So now they issue a line of credit to the baker of $500. Now, what is all the money that exists in the world? It's the $1,000 of actual cash that exists in the bank, plus the $500 that was just given as a line of credit to the baker. So all the money in the world has grown by 50% by one transaction. Now the baker says, well, I can't build a bakery. I'm not a builder. I need to hire a builder to build my bakery. So they go and they find a builder, and the builder says, I can build you a bakery. It's going to cost you $500. So the baker says, I happen to have $500. But you have to open up an account with the bank so you can cash it in. And the builder says, I'm more than happy to do that. He goes to the bank, he opens up an account, and he deposits in there the credits that he got from the baker, which the baker had gotten from the bank, and are now being deposited back into that bank. So how much is all the money that exists in the world now? The $1,000 that was already in the bank originally, that was all the money in the world, plus $500 that was given to the baker, plus the $500 line of credit that the baker gave to the builder. $2,000 now exists in all of the world, half of it in cash and half of it in credit. Does this seem like a Ponzi scheme? Well, in the United States currently, you can repeat this practice 8 times more, meaning for every $1,000 that any bank has in actual money, they can lend 10 times that amount to anybody. And this is a law for all the banks that exist in America and has become pretty much a law for any bank in the world. That means that at any given time, 10 times the amount of credit is out in the world than exists in actual money. So I don't know if you've all seen a very famous movie where they go and it's called It's a Wonderful Life. And It's a Wonderful Life takes place during the parts of it during the Depression. And they make what's called a run on the bank, meaning the local bank is all the people in the town line up and they say, I now want my money. I want my money. I want my cash to come out of that money. And the bank, of course, runs out of money. So what people don't understand often is that happens today. If all of us, my bank is called Wells Fargo. If I were to go and demand all my money, Wells Fargo would happily write me a cashier's check. If my neighbor went, they would happily do that. But if everybody in the town or if everybody in the country went to Wells Fargo today and said, I want all the money that is in my checking account, that is my money, Wells Fargo would not have the money to pay us all back. So this system of credit changed the world. And when did it change the world? It changed the world in around 1500. And why 1500? What happened? Well, up until 1500, the main power in Europe was the church. The church had a certain concept, Christianity. Christianity had certain beliefs. They were moral beliefs. Among those moral beliefs were that we were born, man and woman, and we existed in the Garden of Eden, and that was paradise. And that was our halcyon days. But then Eve ate the apple. We were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And since then, man has been a fallen creature. And the only way that man was ever going to regain that was to go to heaven. That did not exist. Heaven did not exist in this world. So therefore, happiness, satisfaction was not to be found in money, in wealth. In fact, the Bible states it is easier for a camel to crawl through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Morality, being a good person, and money, being a rich person, were non-compatible things for a lot of human history. But something happened in around 1500. So in 1500, all of the value of all of the goods and services in the world was roughly $250 billion. And it had been that way since the time of the pharaohs, from 5,000 years ago until the year 1500. The global GDP, global domestic product, had pretty much stayed stable. But in 1500, it all changed. From 1500 up until now, it has exploded. Right now, the global GDP is not 250 billion. It is 103 trillion. In 2011, just 11 years ago, it was 60 trillion. It has nearly grown by 50% in 10 years. That is astronomical. In order to understand why that changed, we have to understand Christopher Columbus. So Christopher Columbus was born in a port city of Genoa. He was an Italian. And in 1484, he went to the King of Portugal and he said, I have this great idea. You're going to give me the money to build a fleet of ships, and I'm going to sail them west to find new routes to East Asia and all their spices. And the King of Portugal said, 9 out of 10 ships that sail beyond the horizon do not come back. So no, Mr. Columbus, I am not giving you my money. So Christopher Columbus hung his head. And then he went to private investors in Italy, and they said no. In France, and they said no. in England, and they said no. Back to Portugal, and they said no. But then in 1484, he was desperate, and he went to Ferdinand and Isabella, new monarchs of a newly unified Spain, which was not a global or European power at that time. And he said to them, please give me the money to build a fleet of ships, and I will go west, and I will find this for you, and I will make you a lot of money. But he didn't go alone. Like any entrepreneur, he had learned from his mistakes. And ahead of time, Christopher Columbus had hired lobbyists who were friends of Isabella. And at the end, it was Isabella and not Ferdinand that gave Christopher Columbus the money to build 3 ships. And as now every school child knows, Isabella hit the world's largest jackpot. Christopher Columbus went to America. What he found there was gold mines that the Spaniards made, silver mines, tobacco, and sugar. Over the next 20 years, more money was returned to Spain than the money that existed in all of the world. And Spain became the global superpower for the next 200 years. Now, we can argue the morality of it. We can argue all of those things. These are very complicated issues. But from a money point of view, that is what happened. So now something else happened. And it's so important that I'm going to take a moment and I'm going to read to you what happened. So this belief, of course, changed that the global pie that we were fighting, not a pie that was static, that all the money in the world was not a static piece of pie. It was a pie that could grow and grow and grow. That concept changed the world. And it was put into popularity by an economist, a Scottish economist named Adam Smith. Let me read to you what he wrote. In 1776, he published The Wealth of Nations. In the 8th chapter of the first volume, he wrote the following argument. When a landlord, a weaver, or a shoemaker has greater profits than he needs to take care of his own family, he uses the surplus to employ more assistants in order to further increase his profits. The more profits he has, the more assistants he can employ. It follows then that increasing profits of private entrepreneurs is the basis for increasing the collective wealth and prosperity for all. Now, you may not think that this is very novel because we are now entrenched in capitalism. But back then, what he was doing is he was linking wealth and morality and saying, greed is good. If I am wealthy, you too will be wealthy. What he was saying was, if I am poor, Mr. Baker, I will not be able to afford your cakes, and therefore you will be poor. But if I am rich, I can buy cakes from you. You can buy more equipment for your bakery. You can make more cakes. You can enrich your family and enrich the community. That single concept, that credit was available, along with a belief that the future was better than today, not that our best days were behind us, like with Adam and Eve, and that we were in the garden and that we were forever fallen. Not that concept, but the concept that tomorrow the sun was going to shine just a little brighter than today, that maybe it was true that 9 out of 10 ships were going to sink over the horizon. But if that one ship came back and was going to make us more money than all of the ships that were lost, then I could invest money. That is the concept that changed the world. So now, We're going to fast forward a little bit to the early 1700s. So now capitalism has taken root in Europe. But England is a broke state. They are in debt. And if you're a student of history, you may realize this, that when the United States fought England, 1776, for our independence, King Charles had to borrow money from other countries to pay his soldiers to come over here and fight the Americans. The American, meanwhile, were also soldiers, were also not getting paid. They were a ragtag bunch of people. There was no central bank at that time. They were just fighting to protect their land, to protect their homes. So they were willing to go a little bit longer than the professional soldiers of Britain and suffer a little more than they were. And eventually, along with the help of the French, that made a big difference in the war. And now the United States is founded. And it was in the United States and has remained for the last over almost 240 years, where the global power of money has changed. So we now have 13 colonies. It is 1780. There's 13 colonies. But those 13 colonies are not like what we think of as states today. They all have their own economies. They all have separate currencies, and they all have separate agendas. The newly formed federal government and the new presidents don't have a great deal of power. And there is an argument going on between the Federalists, Alexander Hamilton. They were led by Alexander Hamilton, who's now, someone made a musical about him, and the states' rights people. And they were led by Thomas Jefferson. So they came together. And Alexander Hamilton said, look, I want to form a national bank. I want to have one currency. I'm going to buy the debt from all of you, and we're going to issue paper money. And the richest of all the states, Virginia, where Thomas Jefferson was from, said, nope, I don't like that idea at all. That isn't going to work for us. Our economy is not based upon paper. Our economy is based on cotton, labor that they were getting free using slaves. So a deal was brokered between Alexander Hamilton and ultimately Thomas Jefferson. And that was they were going to allow for a central bank. And in exchange, Hamilton was going to give up something to Jefferson that he very much wanted. Slavery was going to continue, and that they were going to move the U.S. capital from New York and Philadelphia closer to where he wanted to be, which is now in Washington, D.C. But the banking system was closer to where Hamilton lived, and he lived in New York. So the banks get set up in New York. And in the early part of the war, that is for the War of Independence, we're selling bonds. Americans are selling bonds. And people begin to sell fake bonds, and the market crashes. And Alexander Hamilton and other people decide that we need to come in and have some rules and regulations. So in the early part of about 1795, 20 people got together under something called a buttonwood tree. And what's a buttonwood tree? A buttonwood tree is a sycamore tree, and it grew in New York. And they gathered there every day, 20 people, to privately exchange and set prices for commodities, wheat, corn. But out of those 20 people, they made something called the Buttonwood Agreement. And that Buttonwood Agreement eventually became Wall Street. And to this day, if you go outside the New York Stock Exchange in New York on Wall Street, there is a sycamore tree, a buttonwood tree, And that is there, and you can take your picture with it. And that is symbolic, because they used to form a group under those boughs to make laws. But the early part of the stock market was incredibly volatile. The government was fairly new to the United States, and they did not understand these concepts, and they were not regulated. So it was prone to booms and busts, booms and busts. It is very hard to find a chart of the New York Stock Exchange between 1793 and, let's say, 1850, 1860, around the United States Civil War. But between those times, it crashed 5 times. It didn't really affect the rest of society because the rest of society was not fully invested in the stock market. But it invested it enough that by 1920, when the stock market genuinely crashed and unemployment in the United States rose to 20%, 1 in 5 Americans were unemployed, and it set forward the Great Depression. It was then that the government came in, set up rules, set up regulations, and said, these are the things you have to follow so that we can have what are called stable and orderly markets. And that's where we're going to leave it for today. But what I want you to think about is this concept. Bitcoin has been around since 2008. It made its public debut in 2009. It is now 2022. And if you look at the charts of the Bitcoin price and of crypto prices, you will see in general that it has been a series of booms, followed by a series of busts, followed by a series of booms, followed by a series of busts. Panic spreads, the markets come down. Greed comes in, and the markets go up. So people are eternally asking, when is the price of Bitcoin going to stabilize and become much more like the stock market? It won't happen for a while because it is not a mature market. And the government has not come in and offered a universal set of rules and regulations that are going to make us all trust it. That is coming in the horizon. Over the next several years, there will be crypto regulation. It will even out the markets. Eventually, or probably sooner rather than later, it may bring the markets down because some of the things that Bitcoin wants and that crypto very much values, anonymity, decentralization, may be taken away. But over the long term, it's going to gain in value and in popularity and use. And so over the long term, regulation is good for Bitcoin. So the next time that we're going to talk about the history of the early markets. What does the stock market mean, and how has it grown over the last 200 years? And we're specifically going to focus on the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ, the 2 largest US markets. We're going to focus on those because they are the 2 largest markets in the world. Together, the markets, those 2 markets, have about 60 trillion in market cap. So over 2/3 of the market cap of all the stock markets in the world are housed in those 2 markets. So that's why we're going to be talking about those. We're going to be talking about how they work and then how that affects Bitcoin. Thank you all. Does anybody have any questions? I don't know how many of you were able to get on, but if we're going to post this a little bit later.
I don't have any questions, but that was very, very interesting. I learned a lot, so thank you.
No problem. If you have any specific questions, you can always email them to us, and then we're going to post them on the website. I'm sure people will have more questions once they're able to view it. So everyone, take good care. And for the advanced people, see you on Thursday. And to continue this, we're going to see you again next Tuesday at 1 p.m. Take good care. Bye-bye.